Welcome to this episode of Washington Policy on the Go. And we've got some big news, a lot of breaking news happening today. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, I wanted to remind you that at any point, if you have a question, enter it into the question toolbox there on your Zoom screen. And we're going to change the format a little bit today in that usually we have question and answer time at the very end. This time, what we're going to do is if you have a question while I'm speaking with the relevant center director, ask it right away because I want to ask those questions during that interview format. If you wait to the end, that particular research director might be gone and you won't get a chance to have that question answered right away. Now you can still ask the question and we'll try and send it to them, or you can send it to them directly by getting their email you can email them here, or you can go on our website, washingtonpolicy.org, and email a center director directly. But it's easier if you just post that question as soon as you think about it. I'll try and incorporate it into the interview as it's going on, and then we'll move to the next subject, and we'll move past those questions and on to the next subject. So trying to make it a little bit easier to use, particularly after the event. So today, because of a breaking Supreme Court case, we're going to start with Paul Guppy, who's here to talk about, originally was to talk about some of Lee Finna, our education director's work, but Paul, our vice president for research, is here, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happened at the United States Supreme Court. Paul, a big court decision today regarding school choice and religious discrimination against schools that had a religious outlook to them. Briefly describe what the court said, and then let's go through what it might mean for Washington State.
Sure. So I'll touch on three quick points. First of all, today's news is that the court ruled in a case called Carson and Nelson versus Macon, Commissioner of Maine Department of Education. Carson
rolls off the tongue.
Yeah.
Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Yeah.
Carson and Nelson are the name of two families that wanted to participate in a Maine state education program. This program has been in place since 1873. And the way it works in Maine is that if you live in a rural area and there is no public high school near you, the state will provide a voucher, money, to your family, and then you can send your children to a private high school. For over 140 years, the state of Maine had a discrimination policy that a family could not choose a religious school. You had to pick a non-religious school. And the argument was that that would be a violation of church and state. Turns out that is not the case. So this case has been in the courts for a number of years, but today the US Supreme Court ruled that it is not a violation of church and state. And in fact, these families have a First Amendment conscience right to participate in a general public education choice program. And to boil this down to one sentence, what the court said is that if a state makes an education benefit available to the general public, they cannot discriminate against religious affiliation or people of faith.
You had a great analogy, I thought. This was off air, but one of the things we had kind of been going back and forth about this earlier today, and you said that basically if person A gets a Social Security check and spends it all on groceries and what they need, and person B does the same thing, except they also give half of it to their church, it's the state can't step in and say, hold on here, we don't want this benefit going here. It's their benefit to do with as they see fit. And
right. Great point. So to illustrate the principle that the Supreme Court ruled on today, you can think of a dozen federal programs and state programs which provide an earned benefit to individuals. So this is veterans benefits. If you're a federal retiree, and you mentioned Social Security, there are lots of cases or handicapped people receive assistance sometimes. So the point being is that many people receive public money as part of a program, and then they can choose what to do with that money. And the courts have said consistently that if you want to take your Social Security check and give it to your local church, go ahead. If you want to use it to pay your rent, go ahead and do that. The principle being, when the individual decides on where public money is going to be spent as part of a personal benefit, that is not an establishment of a religion. In other words, Me receiving a public benefit and then deciding to give some cash to my local church is not the same as the government establishing a church. And that's what today's ruling means.
There's always been this kind of heightened critical reaction to the idea that if government steps in and offers a school choice program, a scholarship, say, particularly for younger kids, K through 12, and the parent were to choose to use that to apply to, a private parochial school with a religious affiliation, then that's somehow discriminatory. But in higher education, people have been making, governments have been giving, our government has been giving scholarships out for a long time, that people have chosen religious schools and there's not this problem. First, am I missing something there? And why do you think that disconnect exists?
You're not missing something. That is a great point. So Seattle University, Gonzaga University, Pacific Lutheran University, anyway, you could name dozens of schools of higher education that either have a religious heritage or are just, Jesuit Catholic colleges or religious colleges. In higher education, there is no controversy here. Students receive loan, grants, aid from in public money all the time, and they turn it over to a religious college and they go to school. The difference is in K through 12, the decision is being made by parents on behalf of a child. And so that's one argument. But of course, the court said that doesn't matter. The parents are the legal guardians of the child and can make decisions on an underage person on their behalf. The practical objection is purely interests and power politics. That in our state, the WEA union does not want competition. They do not want public money to go to private schools for education. That's all there is to it. There are interests in the system who put the education of children second and their own financial interests first. And that is just, again, a straight political controversy based on different interest groups.
It's interesting if you take the word education out and you apply it to something else, like let's say, the state wanted to feed a group of people, and one person said, well, I'm going to use the money from the state to go and purchase groceries at Fred Meyer. And the other says, I want to go to, my atheist farmer's market. And the third goes to, the Amish market, a religious Amish market. The idea of saying, no, you can't go to this religious market to purchase the food that's all the same price or even lower price, maybe the religious affiliated farmer has lower price food. Nobody is going to have a problem with that. But when in education, somehow we've reached this point, and we know why. There's a lot of money and special interests in it. They're very protective, as you point out, against competition. And then and suddenly it becomes this great issue, and that's been a big challenge. We've got some questions coming in. Let me ask a couple of them. Does this mean, the court ruling mean that from the Supreme Court of the United States, that private schools are entitled to the same funding as public schools?
Yes, they're entitled in the sense that if a state creates a generally available public benefit. So the courts were really clear on this. And in the last 3 or 4 years, there have been 2 previous cases that build on this. And in both of those cases, the Supreme Court ruled very consistently. One was in St. Louis, another one was in Montana. And in both cases, the court said that if the state legislature has created a general benefit program, they cannot exclude religious nonprofit organizations. So that is not the same thing as saying that a religious organization gets to participate in a government program in a special way. So direct funding to public schools is targeted and is not generally available. That is funding for public education is a budget item that the legislature has selected. So that doesn't change. What the court said is that if the court creates a generally available benefit, they can't exclude religious organizations.
Right. So if the legislature makes that benefit available, then they can't say, we want this generally available benefit, except for religious schools, or except for these religious outlets. And I guess it doesn't just apply to schools, because the court ruling is a broad religious principle or freedom principle saying, look, And I think it could apply to services in, DSHS and Department of Family and Youth Services
Right.
and various other places as well.
So to give
Prisons.
a basic example, which is the case out of St. Louis about 5 years ago, the city of St. Louis created a kind of infrastructure program where any nonprofit entity could apply for funds to do things like provide playground equipment or repave the parking lot and things like that. And a church applied for this money to repair their playground, and they were turned down because they were a church. So what the Supreme Court ruled is if the city created a public benefit program and anybody can apply, they can't exclude the church from asking for funds to provide street lighting or fix the playground, as I said, or, basic things like that. And the legal principle is that if it's generally available to the public, if the city or a state is saying we're trying to provide money to achieve a community purpose, then everybody is allowed to participate in that community purpose.
Question from Christy: would this apply to vouchers if that were something that was generally available, or instead of the word vouchers, you might use scholarships, which is a more understandable term?
That's a great practical policy question, which is exactly what Washington policy looks into. Like, what does this mean for the people of our state? And the answer is yes. If Washington State created a voucher program or a scholarship program and made it generally available to families. And by the way, the legislature could define the kind of family that was eligible for the voucher. So they may say it's for special needs kids, or it's for foster children, or it's for children of veterans of military families. Those kinds of definitions are fine. The part that involves non-discrimination is when the parents of a special needs child receives a benefit for education, and that family chooses the local Jewish academy for their child, the state can also say that it has to be an accredited school. So it can't just be some, fly-by-night. It has to be a real school. They can set that definition, but they can't discriminate based on religion. So the answer is, if Washington State were to create a voucher or a choice program, all that these rulings say is that Washington State lawmakers could not exclude religious-based schools. Religious schools could participate along with every other kind of school.
A quick question here. How is education? This is a confusion about the generally available benefit. How is education not generally available? Explain what you mean by the change that would have to be, that change that would be required in policy for this to apply to Washington State.
Yeah, again, a great question and kind of a narrow technical point, but is very important from the court's point of view. So as I mentioned earlier, public education is a managed public program that's a line item in the budget. So that's where the state says, we are creating a system of schools. We are going to fund it. It's going to have teachers. We're going to have, academic standards. This is managed kind of like, I'm trying to think of a good, not exactly like Medicaid, but it's like any other kind of, maybe like public streets or something, where the government says we are creating an infrastructure to provide a service to the public, and we are funding it year by year through the budget. With that kind of program, the courts have said the government can define that program however they like. The change is when a generally available benefit is provided to the public, and then this is the key point: when the individual citizen makes the decision. So in the Maine program, what they're pointing out is it's not the government of Maine that gave money to a religious school. The state gave money to the parents, and then the parents made a choice. Going back to our example about the Social Security recipient, the courts have found that it is not a violation of church and state if an individual takes a public benefit and then chooses to give that to a religious organization.
Yeah, there'd be something, it's basically if the state says we're going to create a benefit and provide it. But if they open it up to other providers, that's where this kicks in, basically. Yeah. Let's see. Does it apply to Washington State now that the Supreme Court has ruled? This question from Dusty.
Yeah, it doesn't apply in our state because our lawmakers have not created school choice program. So one thing we point out in our statement today, and that Lee Finna, our education expert, has talked about quite a bit, is that in the last legislative session, there were 4 very innovative school choice bills introduced. None of them passed, but they do provide good ideas, like and every eligible family could apply for $9,000 in a school voucher that they could spend on anything. If Washington State were to create a program like that, this Supreme Court ruling guarantees that our lawmakers, which I could easily envision given our politics, can, despite their personal bias, okay, lawmakers cannot create a carve out and exclude religious organizations. So again, Leave's research has shown that 32 states and the District of Columbia have school choice programs. Washington State is not one of those yet, but if we were to create that kind of program, it would have to be generally available to all schools and all accredited schools in the state. I'll put it that way.
And Washington State tends to be more of a religiously suspicious state, right? I mean, wouldn't you agree with that? Like, there seems to be this approach of suspicion that a religious organization providing the benefit is somehow a problem. But as you can see, you know, in this case, the court's saying that if the state is actively removing the religious option, but allowing it for everybody else, it's the state that's doing the discrimination. It's not
right.
It's not a church and state, you know, the wall of separation. It's not some sort of intermixing. It's the state putting up a wall, which
right.
is
So again, you know, the majority justices today, you know, it's pretty common sense. They said that if the government gives money to a religious organization, that's violates the First Amendment. That's an establishment of a church because there's direct aid going to a particular church. In this case, what the court said is, again, I already said this, but if the state creates a program and the individual citizen decides to use that benefit and spend it at Seattle University or a K-12 Catholic school, let's say, that is permitted.
Now, this question is not quite dealing with the Supreme Court decision, but it's from Heidi. Is it possible to see how much money from property taxes is sent to the state from a community versus how much is sent back to the school district? In my area, the school district's asking for a renewal of a levy because they say they're still not getting enough money from the state to cover all the costs.
Right. So this is a different issue, but I'll kind of touch on it quickly because we spend so much time around here crunching budget numbers. So what happens in local communities is that the school districts tend to play, the state and the school district play off of each other to the disadvantage of the public, we would say. So on the one hand, state lawmakers in Olympia will say, well, we need to provide public funding for public schools, and they'll increase spending, which they have done. Average per student spending in Washington State is now higher than most private school tuition. So it's about $18,000 a year per student in public resources that we're putting into schools. At the same time that the state provides that funding using state property taxes mostly, months later at the local level, the school district will come along to the community and say, we need to fund the schools. It's the same message. They'll say, we need to fund the schools, vote for the levy. And of course, the public feels like if they don't vote for the levy, the public school is going to close. So these two levels of government play off of each other with the same message at different times of the year. The legislature tends to pass the budget in the late spring, but then the following February, there will be a school levy locally, and that's what the questioner is asking about, which will say the same thing. We need money for the school. So after a while, you begin to wonder, like, when is the school funded? Like, when are we done? and that's what's frustrating to most taxpayers.
Yeah, I used to ask the question on my radio show years ago, you know, how do you define fully funded when it comes to education? And that is the question that is avoided like the plague itself from the interest groups and individuals, because if the question was ever answered, you know, you might be able to finish the task. Whereas if you never answer it, there's always, you know, the greater question mark of needing more revenue / taxes.
Right. And the irony is, we've been talking about school choice programs in other states. Many of the programs in those other states do not provide full funding to the families that ask for it. They might provide half, and yet those families are delighted with the support they get, and they use that to go and use a voucher or a scholarship to go to a different school. So in Washington State, we're spending $18,000 per student per year. One of the bills I mentioned in our legislature proposes giving families who ask for it, it's voluntary, $9,000 a year to pay for an education, possibly someplace else. That is a very popular idea, and it meets the definition of fully funded.
And think about charter schools. I mean, they don't get the same funding for resources as other schools do, but there's lots of parents out there that are and students that are choosing them because the school that they were in just was not meeting their needs. It was dangerous. It was failing. And they escape to these charter schools that are doing a great job. So, hey, before we run out of time with you, Paul, I do want to ask you about the original topic, which was Leave wrote a post about a new practice for I think it was North Shore School District officials that wanted to cancel learning assessments and automatically pass every student, regardless of the level of learning that they actually achieve. So everybody's going to get a pass. And so if you failed. If you're not up to a certain, standard, that wouldn't matter. You'd still go forward. And somehow this is supposed to be a benefit. Why don't you describe, what happened and how this might spread throughout the state?
Good point. So this is yet another illustration of how a centralized monopoly system responds to children and families, which is knowing that most people are kind of trapped in their local public school. What bureaucracies will tend to do when they run into, the COVID restrictions or any other difficulty is lower standards, or to think of it in another way is cutting back on the service that you receive. So that's what the North Shore School District is doing. There are 295 school districts in the state. We think that this is becoming a common practice across the state, and that is for administrators and the union, which is negotiated to get this, kind of making life easy on themselves by saying, you know what, we're just not even going to do grades this year. We're going to automatically pass everyone forward. And of course, the problem for that is it shorts the children of the education that they've been promised. So as any educator, public or private, will tell you, maintaining a kind of demanding standard, pushing students to do their best up to their ability. Some students are C students, some students are A students, but every educator knows that as a leader, you have to provide a goal or a standard for the student to strive for. Otherwise, you're just cheating that child. You're giving them an easy pass. And the last point, which fits into what we were talking about earlier, is the solution is for parents in the North Shore District or across the state to always have kind of that back pocket option, which says, if we don't like the way things are operating here, I think they're they're not giving my child the education that he or she deserves. I'm taking my kid and my dollars and I'm going to another school. I'm going to the charter school. I'm going to a private school. If we had a system of wider choices, then officials at the North Shore School District would be a lot more respectful of what parents think.
What do you see as the long-term impact of a policy like this, Paul? Because I'll tell you what, the first thing that popped in my head was my own. I was a good student, but I took one class pass-fail when I was in my senior year, and I barely made it out of that class alive because I didn't try, and I was lucky that I had a teacher that knew my temperament, because he kept me after class and he sat down and he said, "Look, I feel like I failed you, And I said, "What do you mean?" And he says, "You're not trying in this class. You're not really interested in it. You're just on the cusp. You're just barely passing, and you're not really learning anything." And that makes me feel like, as a teacher, I failed, and I just couldn't bear the thought, So then I applied myself, but I think that's, for the most part, it would have been really easy to just slip back in and say, "Well, at least I'm passing barely. It doesn't matter." So with this going kind of school wide, and we already have, as you point out, this massive learning loss in both reading and math, if we graduate students like this with this supposed benefit, what happens to these students who become adults?
Yeah, it essentially, as I said, cheats them. So as every parent, every educator, and every coach knows, any kind of learning or training for children and even young adults is handcrafted. So the thing about the utility monopoly centralized public education system is it assumes that all children are kind of the same or fall within one band. And if you have this kind of industrial conveyor belt, you can run kids through the school. And that's not actually the way, as you're explaining with your own experience. Anyone who has a classroom of 25 kids knows that every kid has a slightly different need. You need to adjust instruction based on where the child is. And so you really serve children when you're presenting them with goals that they can achieve. And that's why we say, you know, every child's education is handcrafted. It has to be individually tailored within the larger program, within the group, in order to help that child go as far as they could go. The community wide impact of this policy of easy passing is it will just widen the achievement gap between different groups of students, because some families are going to private schools, some families are going to public schools where they're more demanding and higher and standards are higher. Some families are doing homeschooling, some are doing voluntary online education. In each of those options, there will be graduates who just flat out got a better education at age 18. They are better prepared for college and the world or the workforce than students who were in school districts that just gave them an easy pass. So the social policy is you end up with a wider achievement gap. And then the kind of tragic thing is the world of the future doesn't get the full contribution of young citizens as they enter society. So the best thing, and what the government promises, is that they will help every young person achieve his best potential to participate in the workforce and in community and to raise a family and build a great future. And by shorting kids on their education, lowering standards, you just make it harder for people to be a success in life later on.
Yeah, I'm picturing, you know, the diminishment of all these diplomas, because, you know, even now you talk to employers, a lot of times the reason they're requiring a college degree has nothing to do with the college degree. They just want to make sure there's a certain standard here, because, you know, diplomas were meaning less and less, you know, and
Right.
you know, that problem could magnify. And, you know, and you know, we think about contributions, but what it really comes down to is massive earning loss for the kids that are passed by this, even after that massive social investment. The opportunity cost of the social investment, we were just saying $18,000 or plus per year, you know, that might not actually deliver the public. I mean, imagine if we had a program to feed people and we said, you know, we're going to pass fail this baby, you know, so some people will eat, some won't, you know, and we had half the people starving and the other half, you know, maybe doing okay, and you know, maybe the upper 10th getting a little fat, but people would be outraged by that, you know. But with this, you can kind of mask over the results with education and language, you know, some camouflage language, and then you know, you just end up with people with lower earning potential and probably greater social dysfunction for you know, for generations, and that's just a horrible thing. Just to be clear, Paul, this is not a statewide policy as of yet. It's
Right.
Is it one district right now, correct?
Well, right. So great point. So it's one due to Leave's kind of hound dog detective work on mostly on Facebook, is she has parents contacting her regularly about what's happening locally. So, you know, she's plugged into this network. She heard, you know, controversy online among parents. These parents were also contacting her directly. They sent her a copy, by the way, of the union, you know, proposal, which would have the automatic passing. So, you know, it's documented. But what that gives us as an insight as to what other school districts might be doing. But we have, you know, data and evidence from one example, and we're kind of raising the alarm that this could be a tactic that's used in other school districts too.
Well, thanks, Paul. I appreciate the news, the breaking news about the U.S. Supreme Court. You can read our latest blog on that at washingtonpolicy.org, and you could share it. That would be helpful for us if you'd share that on your Facebook account. We've posted that on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. So if you want to share that with school choice fans and friends or people concerned about individual liberty, that would be great as well. We'd appreciate that. Paul, again, thank you for stepping in, filling in for leave today, and for that insight into the Supreme Court decision and the possible impacts for Washington State.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Dave.
You bet. All right, let's turn now to Pam Lewison. She is our Initiative on Agriculture Director. Pam has been writing about, there was a lot of action from the governor and from United States Senator from Washington State, Patty Murray, about their draft report on the benefits of removing the lower Snake River dams. That's their idea of creating a report. The last reports the governor had were supposed to study whether there would be a benefit. As we had Todd on, I think last week or the week before, Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director, he pointed out that basically they spent a bunch of money on previous studies that came back and said they were either not sure there would be a benefit or it was an unwise idea to remove the dams. So this time they just changed the nature of the study to what would the benefits be, excluding the possibility that they should not remove the dams. And then they tended to ignore a major factor, and Pam pointed that out in her blog, that factor being the impact on agriculture. Pam, again, why don't you share for us, what would be the impact on Washington's agriculture if the lower Snake River dams were removed?
I think there's it's more, I think that there's some data gaps in how they talk about agriculture in particular. I looked really specifically at the three counties most directly related, which are Franklin, Benton, and Walla Walla counties. And when you look at how the report runs some of the numbers and the impacts of those numbers, they're much different than what the USDA reports in some cases. And in some cases, they take the USDA numbers, but those numbers don't necessarily match real life. And so there's some questions about how that truly works out in terms of real world impact. So, when you look at things like crops and their value, the study says that only about 7% of agriculture in those three counties, 7% of agriculture is accounted for by those three counties. But if you take USDA reports from the ag census, it looks more like 22% of agriculture in the state is represented in those three counties. And instead of having about $327 million in revenue generated, it actually works out to be about $2 billion of revenue generated. Those are vastly different reported numbers.
How do you get to that? Why is the difference so big between these numbers?
I think the difference is they're looking at, honestly, I don't know. They don't cite where their source information comes from.
Well, that's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wish I had an answer. So, and that's one of the things I point out is, where is this information coming from to say that you only have 7% from these three counties? Because my numbers come from the USDA Ag Census. And to be clear, that census is 5 years old. So the numbers could be much different now. In fact, we just went through and responded to our ag census earlier this year and sent it in. It's a federal requirement for everyone who is a farmer and actively involved in ag to fill out their census and send it in, just like everyone else who participates in the census. But instead of the national census that's every 10 years, in ag, you participate in the ag census every 5 years. So there should be new census numbers available next year. So I anticipate seeing an update in that number. So with no source information, I can't tell you where that 7% number comes from, but I can tell you my number comes from the USDA.
And your number is showing, triple the total for the state there.
Yeah.
And I mean, and instead of 327 million in crops, 2.16 billion,
Right.
so you're saying, your numbers are right, but we don't know where they're getting their numbers.
Right. And I think part of that is undercut, particularly that 327 million is undercut really specifically by some of the really valuable crops that are grown in that particular area. Things like wine grapes and potatoes and onions and tree fruit. Those are all value added crops that are extraordinarily expensive. And so when you look at what that looks like in the market value part of it, I would expect to see a $2.1 billion number in terms of what that value of revenue is, not the 327 million.
Well, based on the changes in my grocery bill over the past 5 months, this could be $1 trillion crop at this point now. So, or hundreds of billions at least.
I mean, there's a disconnect between farm gate and grocery store, but I wish there wasn't. It'd be nice. I think I have some other questions that go with this in particular, looking at the claims that go with the irrigated agriculture portion as well. The report says that there's 50,000 acres of irrigated ag in those 3 counties. Again, if you pull up the USDA census information, they say there's almost 500,000 irrigated acres. Again, this report doesn't have any data source information. So there's no way for me to know where they're pulling that information from. Is it based on water permits? Is it based on information from the Bureau of Reclamation? I have no idea where it's coming from. I mean, if they want to call me and have a conversation, happy to visit with anybody from report authors. But if you're looking at USDA irrigated ag reporting information, Snake, Columbia, deep well irrigators, we're talking about 500,000 acres and 500,000 acres roughly. And all of those will be impacted by the removal of the dams because the Snake River dams create reservoirs behind them, which in turn impact the water table all along that shelf. So no matter what happens, the water level is going to change in every single one of those different areas. I'm not a hydrologist, but I do know a little bit about how irrigated ag works. And anytime you have a reservoir behind a dam, it replenishes every other irrigation source. And then I think the last part that I find a little bit questionable is the land value in particular. So this is where the USDA and I depart. The USDA says that land values are about $7,800 an acre for irrigated agriculture. I would happily pay $7,800 an acre for irrigated parcels. Nowhere in Washington State are you buying irrigated land for that cheap. If you look at parcels that are listed on the market right now, they're ranging anywhere from $13,000 to $18,000 an acre. And people will pay that for guaranteed water on their irrigated land. So that makes an average market price of, call it $15,000 an acre. It's almost twice, or I guess about twice what the USDA is reporting for irrigated land. And that's that's a vast difference. So what that comes down to in terms of total mitigation cost, the study says mitigation cost about $1 billion just for the ag portion. I really question that number. I think, we're talking about ag mitigation costs that are double, maybe even triple that amount, just to make sure that ag is functional. And you also have to bear in mind that we don't know what's going to happen with aquifers, because what this study is recommending is But if you have a well, you just drill it deeper. So what happens when municipalities start running out of water? Washington state water right law requires that municipalities are automatically supersede any irrigation or farmland or anywhere else. So then food producers take a back seat to make sure that all domestic wells have water. So you can start to see an effect where farms go out of business because they don't have water to produce what they need to produce, particularly in the semi-arid parts of the state.
Yeah, and what we're also seeing is a pattern here of suspect numbers from a report that when there are real numbers available, I mean, let's face it, the researchers are involved, whoever they may be, have access to all the numbers that you're citing that show a much greater, I mean, by orders of magnitude, greater challenges to the policy that they want, which is the removal of the lower Snake River dams. And they're coming up with, these other numbers that they don't seem to have a bearing on reality. They conflict with official numbers elsewhere, and they're not conforming to a basic market survey of costs per acre. So that's highly suspect as well. Pam, great work. It's just absolutely fascinating, I thought, and it really calls into question, what kind of report the governor and the United States Senator Patty Murray, and we the taxpayers are paying over $300,000 for this report. So it makes me wonder, what we're paying for exactly.
Well, for me, I have to say, I wasn't surprised. I think over the last 2 legislative cycles in particular, we've seen that Olympia, the governor's office in particular, have a really combative relationship with agriculture. So I was not, I guess, taken aback to see that agriculture was heavily undercut in the report, and that the numbers sort of set agriculture aside as being not an important component, either to the state economy, but also to the rural communities that it supports.
It's a frustrating thing, and as you point out, again, it's kind of putting the state agriculture, which, just a reminder for those of you who are not familiar with farming, not involved in it, I mean, I grew up around farms, but they were small farms and mostly cattle when I was a kid. I mean, we had chickens, but not an actual farm like Pam does. But, it's a reminder, farming's usually ranked as, in the top 3 economic engines of the state in terms of the output of Washington State and employment of Washington State. It is a huge financial engine for Washington State that is, it's almost never mentioned, because we mention high tech and we mention Boeing and government sometimes, but not ag. And ag is a very big deal in Washington State. And so, this report and the manipulation of numbers that it appears that we're looking at here is, it's playing with fire, I think, on one of the state's economic engines, and that's a problem. And with people's lives, I mean, and that's a bigger problem.
I think it speaks to a larger issue about things like food security. And, you touched on food in the grocery store being more expensive. And some of that really is about market pressure and also about producer pressure. So when you look at, like, the heat dome last year created a shortage in certain produce because it quite literally got too hot, and it either cooked during the growth cycle, and we just couldn't get enough water to certain things in the middle of their growing cycle, and they died. Or we didn't have enough people to harvest at peak times because it was just too hot. And so I think the reverse that you can see is, if we run out of water, you have the same sort of problem, only the shortages are greater, because we rely really heavily on water in Washington State to produce food in general, particularly in Eastern Washington. Again, we're a semi-arid area that averages approximately 11 inches of rain a year. And yet we grow a vast number of crops that require a great deal more water than that, particularly in the central basin. And so without irrigation from the Snake, irrigation from Columbia River, we become an area that's sagebrush and jackrabbits again. And then we're out of things like potatoes, berries, wheat, sweet corn, the things that we all rely upon on a regular basis.
Final question for you, Pam. The report had a tone change that focused a lot on treaty rights, Native American treaty rights. Do you think that that tone change, which was pretty abrupt, I mean, before it's always been about the salmon or whatever, this time the focus is on about treaty rights. Do you think they're trying to skip Congress and the legislative process and try to follow the culvert blueprint where, you know, they say that it's a treaty issue and they can then get the courts to do what the legislature and the people do not want?
Possibly. I think there are some other topical issues that come up when it comes to treaty rights. Certainly, we have an onus to ensure that that tribal security is respected and understood, and I think that should be part of the discussion. Do I think that tribal rights should supersede an entire state and an entire economy? Certainly not. I think there needs to be a balance that's had between making sure that we are supporting as many people as possible and also keeping an eye on some balance in communities, whether they are tribal or underserved or underrecognized. And I would argue that we can find a balance if we are willing to actually have a real conversation with every single stakeholder who has the potential to lose their livelihoods in the event that we don't have access to water.
Well, thank you, Pam. Appreciate your contribution as always. And as I said, this is really fascinating work, I thought.
Thank you.
Now, I need to call on Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform Director now. Before we run out of time, he's had some breaking news today. We're going to talk to him originally about the revenue forecast, which we will address, but the city of Seattle has scored a court victory on a new tax that they want. Jason, tell us about this breaking news.
Yeah, so Dave, the income tax is the Kevin Bacon of Washington policy. It doesn't matter what the issue is, at some point it's going to come back to the income tax, right? The 7 degrees of separation. So what Seattle did after they failed to do an income tax, you may recall they tried to do this back in 2017 in the Supreme Court, in the Court of Appeals, and the Superior Court all said, you can't do this, this is unconstitutional. Well, Seattle has never wanted to take no for an answer on trying to be creative on taxes. So they came up with Plan 2.0, which they called an employer compensation tax. And I have to give them credit. When they did this, it's very stupid, in my opinion, policy when you're trying to encourage wage growth in high earning jobs to penalize an employer for providing those jobs. But Seattle said, we're not going to tax employees, but we're going to tax an employer for what they pay their employee. So it's a tax on the compensation paid. And they tried to graduate that. So the more you pay an employee, the higher the tax on the business is going to be. Now, again, kind of ridiculous policy, and it's very easy to avoid just by deciding you're going to have a business in Bellevue or someplace besides Seattle. But they threaded the needle, right? It's not an income tax. It's not a tax on the employee. It's a tax on the employer. And as expected today, the Court of Appeals unanimously ruled that, yes, this employer compensation tax is legal. Seattle can move forward with it, which means we may see some copycat and we may see other cities try to do the same. But this is where the cautionary tale comes in, because while Seattle got the green light, the state has no interest in this. Believe it or not, Washington State has a tax structural working group that's looking at reforming the state's tax system. And earlier this year, they voted to remove 4 taxes from consideration. They're not going to look at a VAT, a value-added tax. They're not going to look at a personal income tax. They're not going to look at a corporate income tax. And they're not going to look at an employer compensation tax. And the reason cited for that was impacts on economic growth.
I'm still trying to come to grips with how this tax works on the employment compensation. Can you run through that one more time for the more dense among us?
Yeah, so a traditional income tax is you as an employee pay a tax on your compensation.
Right.
You can't do that in Washington, and there's been multiple rulings on that. So what Seattle did, and again, I got to give them credit because they legally threaded this needle for very poor economic policy. But maybe I get to keep my TV law degree because I predicted this ruling because I think they got it right legally. So what Seattle is doing is saying, okay, we are not going to directly tax the employee. You get your full paycheck. Now you may get a smaller paycheck. You may not get raises because the employer has to address this tax liability in their profit margin, but the tax is not on the employee. We are going to tax the employer for paying you.
Based on the amount that they paid you.
Correct.
So, okay. Yeah, I can see where that could end up relating to another headline I saw today, which was Amazon's top 10,000 employees. I think it was Amazon in Bellevue. Google Amazon, one of them, heading off to Bellevue and increasing the number of employees stationed there instead of Seattle. So I can see where that would be a spreading decision.
We also got to think about the burden on the businesses because most of the businesses in Seattle that are going to be triggering this tax are not just based solely in Seattle. They're throughout Washington, they're throughout other cities. You've got a lot of employees now post-pandemic working remotely, but you only owe this tax on your Seattle employees. So now you have to track the time and how long they're working in Seattle versus other places to try to determine your tax liability.
Wow. And that's going to be a pain for them, or they'll just move. I mean, it's not like you're stuck being there, although, some people might have real estate investments that keep them, there for a while. But, there's a thing that, people, I've heard them say, Jason, that this kind of craziness that goes on in Seattle, eventually this changes and the city, pulls itself toward great policy. But I can think of a number of cities that were once great that never really changed. They just, the decay started and it just kind of spiraled. And that's what I fear for Seattle, which is, it would be possible for it to become a place that, showed all this promise and growth and then, shrivels because of its own avarice,
Let me take you back to the story from this weekend, right? So this is the breaking news. Golf clap Seattle. You have gotten through a very economically disruptive legal tax on your employers. But the headline out of this weekend was because Seattle predictably used one-time federal COVID funds and one-time funding to increase its budget, it is now looking at a structural budget problem. So what, of course, is the solution from their standpoint? Not to reduce spending. It's the quote from their budget chair is, I need to figure out new progressive taxes like this employer compensation tax to continue our spending. So my prediction now that Seattle's been given the green light for this, wait for the increase in this new tax to come next.
Yeah, and that is an excellent point. And it's a frightening one as well. I mean, as much as I like to make fun of Seattle, it's been an economic engine, for the state. It's the big city, I mean, I've still got hope that maybe we could transfer to a different city, but I do not wish Seattle ill. I want it to do well, and I want things to improve there, and I'm not seeing that. There's a couple of questions we have from the audience about this tax. Would it apply to both public and private employers?
Shockingly, the government is exempt, and there are some other exemptions.
Well, that's always helpful. And what's the threshold for the tax again in terms of pay?
I do not know that off the top of my head, but this was originally part of the Amazon tax effort from Sawant that ran into a lot of opposition. So this was their rehash of that to try to fit it within the legal framework of not being able to tax income. So it is on the graduated scale, and that's why my prediction is with their budget situation, they'll probably decide the course of least resistance is just to increase this new tax.
Yeah, it's amazing to me, and you've pointed that out a number of times, how many one-time sources, that they were using to fund continuous programs, and so this is very predictable. And then, we have a situation where affordability is a very big issue for a lot of people in Seattle already. Just their housing's a big enough problem. But then, with gas prices going up and the cost of living going up, this for the city not to recognize that. It's just it's really sad and indicative of a problem that's spreading and sprouting deep roots rather than going away. Jason, we're running out of time, so I want to turn now to the revenue forecast of the state. You pointed out the revenue forecast offers yet another opportunity for something that you've been calling for some time. Why don't you run it through for us?
Yeah, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to try again. I thought the stars had aligned back in January when Washington had a balanced budget, billions in reserves, billions of COVID relief funds that hadn't been spent yet, and a $10.5 billion increase in the revenue forecast. I thought that was going to be the time we finally maybe could see some tax relief from the governor and the legislature. Unfortunately, it was not to be. So here's the second bite at the apple, because even after that huge increase in spending and using a lot of those revenues in the supplemental budget, collections are still coming in higher than expected. So the monthly tax collections have been in almost 6.5% higher. That's just around $600 million. Now, that doesn't mean that's a linear increase over 4 years for the revenue forecast, but tomorrow, my expectation is we're going to get another big increase in the revenue forecast. So it's just another opportunity, especially with these inflationary pressures, for the lawmakers to prioritize that. And what gives me some hope is, let me just quote to you the governor of New York, the governor of California, the president of the United States. We have got to start providing some tax relief to inflation hammered citizens. Maybe that's a message that our governor can get as well.
Has there been any, usually if something like this happens, or there's this, this kind of expected good news, there's certain officials would want to jump in front of the camera or the news, get quoted in the newspaper saying, hey, look, we're really hopeful that we can do this and provide tax relief. Have you seen any indicators like that in Washington State yet?
So the governor was actually asked point blank by the Associated Press, if the revenue forecast is up again and noticing that everybody else in the country is cutting taxes, will you provide some type of tax relief to help with inflation? The governor's response would be that he would be very surprised if there was ever a revenue increase large enough not to meet all the needs for things he wants to spend money on.
Wow. I guess that says it all. So you're saying that you haven't given up hope yet. You've got an amazing optimistic gene there. We need science to study you and figure out how to give it to the rest of us. So, and look, with public, as Abraham Lincoln said at one point, I'll paraphrase, with public opinion, anything is possible. Without it, nothing is. So the more the public speaks out, the more the public shares the view that, hey, tax relief based on these tough times is essential to us, the more likely it is that others in positions of power will change their minds on that kind of issue. So any closing remarks, Jason?
And just, it's kind of like with emergency powers. Washington is just such an outlier compared to the rest of the country. And the same is true with this tax debate. Everybody is recognizing the need for tax relief. So even though the governor may not see that, maybe there's still an opportunity for the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader to come to that conclusion.
Well, thank you, Jason, and thank all of you for watching. We'll post this on YouTube, and if you see anything you like, information that you appreciate, we urge you to share it with others. And we appreciate it. We'll see you in 2 weeks with another episode of Washington Policy on the Go.